It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the Six Bridges Book Festival featuring writers Mark Barr, who wrote Watershed, Stacey Margaret Jones, who wrote Mr. Catherine, and Tyrone Jaeger, who wrote Radio El Dorado. As an added bonus, all of these authors live in Arkansas. My name is J. Bradley Minnick, and I'm the host of the radio show Arts and Letters, broadcast on KUAR 89.1 FM. And I've had the opportunity to previously interview both Mark and Tyrone for our show, and we'll soon be interviewing Stacey. So be on the lookout for these upcoming episodes. Also, please consider Wordsworth Books if you want to purchase copies of these novels or any of the books featured at this year's Six Bridges Book Festival. And please take time to fill out the form at the end of the session. This helps us with our analytics and assessment reporting. A bit of housekeeping on how this will work. We'll hear about each book first and have a little short reading, first from Mark, then from Stacey, and then from Tyrone. It's my hope that our readings will allow us to have a conversation amongst us, asking each other questions about how each of you have worked with the intersections of both time and place, so important to each of your novels. The audience should feel free to use the chat function and to ask questions that all relate to the author. So let's begin with Mark Barr. Mark lives here in Little Rock with his wife and sons, and his short fiction and essays have appeared in Wisconsin Review, Poets and Writers, Lit Hub, Necessary Fiction, and elsewhere. Watershed has received wonderful reviews from Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, and Booklist, and it was awarded the 2019 David J. Langham Senior Prize in American Historical Fiction, and Watershed was also named as one of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's 12 Southern books you want to read this fall. Watershed is set in 1937, and much of it revolves around the construction of a federal dam in Tennessee. So welcome, Mark, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks to Six Bridges for putting on the festival and including me in this panel. Thanks to my fellow panelists and to you, Brad, for hosting. So like Brad said, my book is Watershed, set in the 30s, and like you said, deals largely with the construction of a hydroelectric dam, and I guess also deals with, more largely with the coming of electricity to the rural countryside, which was a big deal because for decades it had been available in the larger cities, and it was sort of a delayed rollout in the United States. I've chosen to try to dramatize that story through two characters, Claire and Nathan. Claire is a wife and mother whose life is upturned early in the book, and sort of gets her first taste of a career outside the home. And Nathan, who is an outsider who's come to town to work on the dam that they're building, and but who in short order we discover has some things he's running from. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of my book. This is chapter 1. Claire was sleeping when the discomfort started, and it pressed its way into her dreams before she finally woke. The taste in her mouth had gone brassy and sharp, and her middle was heavy, as if a hot stone had become lodged inside her pelvis. She peeled back the sheet. Travis lay on his back, big arms sprawled, breathing evenly. He hadn't bathed before coming to bed, and the smell of river dirt and sweat rose from him. It took her a moment to find her shoes, and then a moment longer to slip them on, laces forgotten in her hurry. It was like the time she'd had the diarrhea and could hardly hold back her insides when they took a mind to come running out. But this was in her bladder, or lower. She took down the candle she kept by the door and lit it with a match. She unlatched the door and hurried across the dark to the outhouse. When she hitched up her nightgown and let go, the burning left her breathless. It was like she'd been touched with a branding iron. She put a hand to herself and then held it to the candle's flickering light. What was on her finger was a yellowed white and sticky. "Damn him," she said. The burning pulsed again, and she quietly swore. After the moment passed, she started back for the house. It took her shaking hands 2 tries to light the big lamp in the kitchen. A dim light washed the walls, and she found herself looking at Travis's rifle, leaned in the corner to one side of the fireplace. She allowed her gaze to rest on it for a moment, then turned her face away. In the bedroom, Travis had shifted to the middle of the bed. One sleep-flung arm lay across her pillow. Her clothes were folded on a chair, and she began putting them on. He rolled over and ran a hand through his hair. "What are you doing up?" he asked in a gravelly voice. She kept buttoning her dress, and he lifted his head. "It's late, Claire," he said into the pillow. "Come back to bed." She thought again about the rifle. Her hurt was more than she could contain. When she spoke, her voice was hard. "You've given me something. You brought it home. You brought it home to your wife." He squinted at her, and she began to tie her shoes. He seemed to at last realize what she was about. "Don't you try it," Travis said. Claire took the lamp and went into the children's room, leaving him in the dark. She roused them each, and they sat up in their beds, covering their eyes against the light. "What is it, Ma?" the boy asked. The girl, naked save for her wadded diaper, began to cry. Claire handed the lamp to her son and picked her daughter up. She turned in place, realized she'd need her hands free to pack, and put the girl back down. Travis stood in the doorway, his shadow cast behind him by the lamp. "I'm warning you," he said. Claire addressed her son. "Tom, pack up a couple days' worth of clothes for yourself and your sister. Get a sack from the kitchen." The boy put the lamp on the bedside table and got up. "You sit down," his father said, pointing to the bed, and the boy did, staring. "Tom," Claire said, "I told you what to do. Go on." The boy got up again and squeezed by his father. Travis didn't stop him. Claire shushed the crying girl and began dressing her. Tom came back with a bleached flour sack, began taking clothes from the dresser. When he was finished, Claire took the bag from him. "Take your sister now. Go wait in the car." The boy stared at her with wide eyes, but didn't move. "Go on, Tom. Don't make me tell you twice," she said. And he picked his sister up under the arms and worked past his father once more. Travis made no move to stop him, and the boy shuffled down the dark hall. When she heard her son unlatch the front door, she held the lamp so she could see Travis's face. "How long have you had it?" "I wasn't sure if I did," Travis said. He ran a dirty nailed hand over his cowlick. "How long?" "A week, 2. The lamp in her right hand, Claire hit him as hard as she could with her left. His passive face took the slap, and his own hand swung around in response and clapped her across the cheek. She saw a flash and fell against the wall. The lamp went out. In the dark, she could feel him reaching for her, down on his knees now. "Claire, Claire," he was saying in a regretful voice. She pushed away the hands. He caught at her skirts, pulling her back. She kicked once, twice, and then she was free, running down the hall. Someone had left a chair pushed out at the table, and she went right over it, knocking her breath out of her when she fell. She could hear him coming down the hall now, and she forced herself up. The boy was on the front porch waiting for her. "Get in the car," she said, pushing him off the porch. Behind her in the house, she could hear Travis calling. When she got to the car, her daughter was crying again. Claire took up the starter crank with both hands and pulled it through the cycle as hard as she could. The engine came alive, and she got behind the steering wheel. As she turned the car around, the headlights swept the house, showing Travis, his unkempt hair, his grubby underwear, framed in the front doorway. She gained the road with a bump and pressed the gas, even as a piece of her realized that Travis had never come farther than the porch. She steered the car along the dark track. From the seat beside her, she could feel the boy's eyes, large, searching her profile for some explanation. When she glanced at him, the spell was broken, and he spoke. "Where are we going, Ma?" She was asking the same question to herself, marveling at her temerity, untested before now. Having leaped, where would she land? She was half surprised when she knew the answer, though it did anything but buoy her. "Grands," she said, the word like a rock in her mouth. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Mark. That was very powerful. We'll go to you, Ty. So Radio El Dorado transports us back to the 1960s to rock and roll, anti-war, and environmentalism. Born and raised in the Catskill Mountains, Ty Jaeger now lives in Beaver Fork Lake, Arkansas with his wife and daughter. He holds the Margaret Barry Hutton Odyssey Professorship with Maxine Payne called Audiovisual Arkansas Citizen Storytellers, which he talked about with me, and it just sounds fascinating. And teaches courses on creative nonfiction, fiction, hybrid literature, and digital storytelling at Hendrix College. In addition to the novel Radio El Dorado, he has written story collection So Many True Believers and the cross-genre novella The Runaway Note. His writing has appeared in journals such as the Oxford American, Southern Humanities Review, High Desert Journal, and the Literary Review. Jaeger is the recipient of the Porter Fund Literary Prize and the Frank O'Connor Award for Short Fiction. So let's hear from you now. Hi.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Mark and Stacey. Thanks to the Six Bridges Book Festival. Thank you, all of you, for coming out. And I also want to quickly give a shout out to my wife, Julie, whose birthday was yesterday. She made this fancy shirt. See that stuff right there? That's good. All right, so what you need to know about what I'm going to read. The short chapter that I'm going to read is about 100 pages into the book. As Brad said, the novel takes place during 1969, 1970. The anti-war protests are kind of like the backdrop to the book, as well as the Mother's Day fire that occurred at the Rocky Flats nuclear bomb plant, where they made plutonium triggers. And there was a fire that would have been of Chernobyl-like proportions had it not been contained. And so Alvin Wund, who's a character in this chapter, is a farmer turned security guard who was forced to fight the fire, and he's traumatized by that experience. And the character that we sit with for most of the chapter is this guy, Nat Moda. He's 90 years old. He is a major shareholder in Doom Chemical. Dow Chemical actually was the company that ran Rocky Flats. And so it's Nat Moda's birthday, and his intent is to give Alvin this gift for his involvement fighting the fire. And they live in the same region, so they've known each other most of their lives. And I'll also say that one of the great pleasures that I take in novel writing, Mark and Stacey are I think, extremely well-versed plotters. I am not so good at plot, but what I am good at is digression and diversion. And so I oftentimes will have these characters pop up in my novels that may be sort of secondary characters, but you get sort of occasionally deep turns in their heads. And that's what this is. The Moda Ranch sat at the mouth of El Dorado Canyon and extended north and east across the lip of the Front Range and out onto the broad pan of the plains. The sun was skewered on the crown of the Continental Divide, and the valley was soon swallowed in shadows. In the space between the outbuildings and barn, Emery Moda hosted a party for his father's 90th birthday. Tables with blue and white checked tablecloths held a feast of spare ribs, German potato salad, tamales, pinto beans, coleslaw, an array of pickles, and a goat that 2 hours into the banquet was little more than bones and eyeballs. From the porch, a dinner bell rang, and in a modest ballroom that hadn't seen a formal dance since 1953, Emery and his brother Donald gathered their guests. They stood in front of a table that held 2 towers of intricately iced birthday cake that approximated El Dorado Canyon. The brothers waited to announce the guest of honor, while the guests themselves clustered in two adjacent corners where Emery's sculptures dominated, constructed from disassembled steel plows, rakes, and other farm machinery. Two 10-foot-tall dinosaurs jested threat, and in the two corners hung flying saucers built of the same junked machinery. There were in total perhaps about 50 people in attendance, nothing on the order of what the ballroom had once held. The elder Moda had sworn off large crowds ever since an episode at the National Western Stock Show in 1962, when a petulant child had attempted to ride a mutinous sheep through the throngs waiting to sample locally harvested Rocky Mountain oysters. While the sheep zigzagged through the masses, the child hung on for his dear impish life with nothing but 2 handfuls of fleece, his skinny legs, his oversized resolve, and a gap-toothed smile as wide as the plains. A near riot ensued, and Nat Moda was knocked off his feet. Amidst the screams and laughter, he looked up and saw nothing but a confusion of legs, and then the sheep bounding his way, the imp laughing maniacally. It was the boiled egg smell of fear that sent Nat reeling back to Mokodamus in 1887, when a rail worker had threatened to kill him. He had no choice but to pull his pocket knife, and as the would-be killer approached, Nat sliced its throat in what he had hoped would be one quick motion. However, owing to the thickness of the fleece, it took some sawing. The would-be cowboy, trapped beneath the beast, was covered in sheep's blood. And when the boy's father and stock show security pulled Nat off, he noticed that he too had sustained injuries, hoof-related, to the face and groin areas. The pain was immense, but nothing like the humiliation of police detention and subsequent release upon his younger son's arrival. The hush money was enough to keep the brat in cowboy boots and mutton well into middle age. Thus, the imp's indulgent parents had not pressed charges. And without further ado, Donald Moda said, I present you with the birthday boy, my father, Nathaniel Moda, 90 years young. Emery walked Nat Moda to the head of the table where the birthday cake towered. Next to the table was a sheet draped over an amorphous form that was taller than a man. The guests hesitantly applauded. The old man stooped over the table, rapping it with his cane. His chin jutted forth and he surveyed the revelers through his clouded eyes. He had the good looks of a wax museum John Wayne, realistic and handsome until you got up close and saw the dusty creases upon the plastic sheen. So many friends and so many enemies, he said. He wheezed a clotted lungful of mirth. I'll document you all in a manuscript I'm writing. It's my last contribution to humankind. He leaned on his cane and appeared absorbed in the exact point where the rubber tip met the floor. His tongue searched the corners of his mouth. I can't see as I once did. Our bodies fail, but I have been fortunate enough to retain my sense of smell. I have olfactory powers beyond the range of most humans, smell being the key to memory. Memory is all you have when you reach my age. Nat Moda paused and looked around, his eyes blanker than those of a dead fish. Periwinkle, he said. Periwinkle in a field of columbine. I ate her with sweet butter churned by my dear mother's hand. There came muffled laughter from the back, where Alban One's daughters and their ruffian friends stood huddled and aloof. And Nat came too. He had lived with the Aka Pygmies, explored the wildest jungles, and had, until recently, sectioned off the Moda Mansion for the rehabilitation of lunatics. He was accustomed to creatures unable to control the prattle issuing from their mouth holes. Tonight, I will make a gift. Nat put his hand on the coverture and pulled the sheet to reveal the mountain lion standing on its hind legs, front paws ready to strike, sharp-toothed mouth opened and stimulating a roar, and upon its chest were 2 fur-covered human-shaped breasts, each topped with a pink nipple. Nat sniffed the air about the mountain lion's head as the partygoers clapped. wowed, and snickered. "Before you is a wampus cat," Nat said. "As you know, I am descended from the Cherokee beloved woman, Nanye High. And according to Cherokee legend, there was once an Indian woman who disguised herself with the hide of a mountain lion for the purpose of spying on her husband. She eavesdropped on a circle of men as they told sacred, Nat pounded the table with his cane, stories forbidden to women. And when they discovered her, they had no choice but to punish her. The medicine man turned her into a creature half woman, half mountain lion. She was forced to wander the woods, and to this day she is known to frighten ranchers and slaughter livestock." Nat paused and soon became lost in his own silence. He looked hopefully at the mountain lion, as if he expected the stuffed beast to feed him a line. An unmanly, yet certainly male cackle came from the crowd. "Ah, yes," Nat said, the giggle prompting his thoughts. Alvin Wund killed this mountain lion with a single shot." The cackle again came from the back, followed by laughter from the ruffians. "Alvin Wund, like the wampus cat, is a creature of legend. And on Mother's Day, while most of us slept comfortably, Alvin tirelessly fought a fire that might have developed into something serious had it not been snuffed." Nat cleared his throat and coughed repeatedly, rapping his cane in time against the table. "The lifelike memories of this legendary creature are a silicone product developed by Doom Chemical. In the future, our women will wear such memory inserts or perhaps memory brassieres in the same fashion that we once wore powdered wigs. That is to say, different styles for different occasions." Nat pounded the cane against the table once more. "Please, Alvin, accept this gift, a symbol of the American past and the American future." I'm going to pause here to say that Alvin, 5 months prior, lost his wife, so he's a widower. His wife's name is Esther. Is Esther. In the middle of the small crowd, Alvin smiled meekly. He had been talking with the El Dorado Springs town clerk, a widower by the name of Charlene, who had a certain plumpness that Alvin couldn't help but want to reach out and touch. "Oh, Alvin, congratulations," Charlene said. She stood on her tiptoes and planted a wet kiss on his cheek. "Well," Alvin said, looking down at Charlene and her smile. With a push from his daughters, Alvin walked to the front of the room. Behind him, Ursula, who had never been able to execute the volumetric design of a proper whisper, said, "V, that's the lion. That's the lion that Mom shot." Up front, Alvin looked from the mountain lion to the El Dorado cake. He removed his horn-rimmed glasses and rubbed his eyes. He sniffled and removed an unlit, chewed-up cigar from his mouth. "I don't know what to say, Nat. Mr. Moda, thank you. I'm sure any man would have done what I did. I was just doing my job. If it hadn't been for Romy Nurnberg." Here Alvin choked up and again removed his glasses, this time to wipe away tears. "Many thanks," Alvin mumbled. Nat patted him on the back with one hand and slammed his cane to the floor with the other. "Buck up, old man. Why don't we hear from Esther now?" Alvin looked like a man caught in a tunnel with the train bearing down. He whispered, "She's dead, you fool." "I've never understood your sense of humor, son," Nat said. "Where is she? Come now, Esther. You can't hide from me like you do from Alvin. Ha, ha, ha." While the party guests looked to the bottom of their glasses in mortification, Emery and his dark-haired wife, Susanna, led Nat away from the table and to the bevy of medications that awaited him nightly. Thanks.
Thank you, Ty. You say you're not a plotter, but that had a pretty strong plot. Thank you.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Next we'll hear from Stacey. Stacey Margaret Jones' novel, Mr. Catherine, is set in Little Rock. And it's a thriller mystery about a missing wife and secrets and guilt and forgiveness. Stacey is the youngest in a family of 9 and grew up in South Dakota. She's been nominated for a Pushcart Prize in Poetry and her short stories have been anthologized in international journals. She lives in Conway with her husband and 4 dogs.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the festival, and thank you, Brad, for the session, and thank you to my co-panelists here today. This is really fun for me and very special. I'm going to read from the beginning of my book as well, from Mr. Catherine. And at the beginning of the book, the book begins about a year after Catherine has confessed to her husband that she had an affair and the affair has ended. And as the action starts, she's gone for a run on the Little Rock River Trail, and her husband is realizing that she's been gone a little bit too long, and he also has some of the anxiety that he used to have when he couldn't find her or she wasn't where she was supposed to be creeping in. So we'll just start there. He's, as I said, he's looking for her. He's realizing that she's been gone too long and he can't reach her on her phone. I put on my sweatpants and grabbed my keys, leaving the dogs out on the deck, which we never did when we weren't home. Wesley barked and I heard him pawing the French doors, confused. I had left my car in the driveway overnight, and as I was opening the door, one of our neighbors, Richard Copley, jogged past, finishing his own run. He waved without looking at me, distracted by his exhaustion. It was cold, with temperatures in the 20s, but he was wearing running shorts. His only nod to the weather was a thin white long-sleeved technical shirt and a baseball cap. "Have you seen Catherine?" I yelled at him, noticing his earphones and their thin web line to his iPod. "What? Sorry." He pulled the earbuds out. He looked concerned, his eyebrows knitting in worry, not irritation. "Catherine left to run at her usual time this morning," I panted, as if I'd been sprinting. "But she's not back yet. She's not answering her phone. Have you seen her?" "No, I started to get in the car when he said no, but he kept talking. Is she running in the neighborhood or at the river trail?" "River trail," I called through my open window as I started to back out of the driveway. He stood in the street. "I'll keep an eye out for her." We lived a short distance from the road that led down the steep hill to the river by the Big Dam Bridge parking lot, but there were corners and steep grades. I went as fast as I dared. The trees were brown and bare. They wouldn't begin to bud and leaf for at least another month, when color would explode throughout the city, especially around the Arkansas River that flowed toward the Mississippi Delta. Without fog, I could have seen it, dark and gray through the naked branches and between the houses propped up on stilts that lined Overlook Road, a steep, straight hill that ran down to the river shore parks. Instantly, I felt relief when I saw her silver Acura parked in one of the first spaces closest to Rebsamen Road. "She's here, she's here, she's here," I chanted to myself as I approached the lot. I still couldn't see the river, though it was probably less than 20 or 30 yards down the bank, buried in the velvet fog. The little bit of path I could make out was empty, but I heard the footfall of a runner as I got out of the car. I jogged a couple of steps toward the end of the path where I could see the vague shape of a water fountain. But the runner who emerged, first a shadow and then a figure, was a man. He turned to cross the parking lot and mount the path to the bridge. He vanished into the clouded morning. I looked down to see I was still wearing my slippers. And now I know things that only a few other people knew, one whom I despise and blame, and one whom I have now forgiven. I am bound to them because we know these things only we know. And that is my way of resurrecting the dead, or at least of pretending the dead know I do forgive. I did know my wife was having an affair. That is what I didn't want to know. I despised her for believing she was fooling me, and I was humiliated because she was trying to trick me. Are affairs addictions? A promise of some delicious reward that causes the addict to behave both impulsively and compulsively? Over the course of those months, I saw my wife begin to behave like an addict in many ways, building small secrets into her days, into her routine. She was incrementally more distant, less accessible, and less vulnerable to me. Her other compulsions and impulses also seemed at heightened levels, as if they all rose together from the same deep well. She wasn't saying no to herself, and someone else wasn't saying no to her either. Just because I'm a therapist doesn't mean I'm not just as adept as anyone else at avoiding painful realities or thinking that I can. Once she confessed, I saw the evidence all around me, how much she had spoken of him, his influence on her choices of trivial things, restaurants, what to watch on television, how she broke plans with me with 10 minutes notice if something came up he needed. I hadn't wanted to see it, and so I didn't. But even at the time, one thing I couldn't avoid was her growing attachment to her phone. She looked like the Hollywood starlets I saw on the covers of celebrity magazines in the checkout line at the grocery store, with that technical appendage attached to her palm, whatever she was doing, making breakfast, watching television, putting her makeup on. Who was the text from? I had asked her one night, impulsive as well. I spoke as I thought the question. She had asked me to drive home from Cheers in the Heights neighborhood of Little Rock, where we'd had a late dinner. I was driving her car so she could check email on her phone, but it buzzed a text alarm almost immediately after we pulled out of the parking lot. Work, she said vaguely, and her self-conscious, assessing sideways glance at me made me skeptical. She clicked a reply and then toggled back up with her long, deft fingers. I was stopped behind someone turning left off Pine Valley Road, which wound out of the Heights to our neighborhood. I took this road often to avoid Cantrell Road's many traffic lights and regular lane closures. I turned to hear her answer, and I saw her delete the whole message thread. She was silent. Why are you deleting all those messages? I sounded a little frantic when I wanted to sound forceful or at least hint that I could see something was happening right under my nose. What? She asked, staring into the rectangular white screen that was blazing like the sun in the dark car. I didn't repeat my question. She wasn't listening, or she would have refused to answer. After the driver turned, we traveled a few more curves and hills into Kingwood, our neighborhood between Cantrell Road and the Arkansas River, before she gave up on another response and tucked the phone into her purse, which she held in a miserly way in her lap. She said nothing and gazed out the window at the passing trees. That house is for sale, she said, pointing, but we had passed it. Which one? The one that's for sale, she said, and smiled, reaching over to pat my leg with her left hand as I drove, recalling a recurring joke in our 13 years together. I relaxed slightly, but she took her hand away and kept looking out of the car at the houses we drove by. I wanted her hand back. This is when I first used the magical thinking of a cuckolded husband. If she puts her hand back on my leg, she's not cheating on me with her boss. If she turns to me at the next four-way stop and starts a conversation, she still loves me. If she still loves me, she is not cheating on me. And that is when I knew what I didn't want to know. And I didn't say anything on the way back from Burgers and Beers, where she met me after coming from a late meeting. I knew who he was, and it was a painful thing to realize your wife is in love with someone you despise. At the bridge, I ran back to Catherine's car. I could see she had done what I had asked her multiple times not to do. She'd thrown a jacket and a shopping bag over her purse and left it on the floor of the passenger seat instead of putting it in the trunk or leaving it at home. The doors were all locked. I looked around again, but this time I heard nothing, and no one came into view from the fog. It was now almost 7:30 a.m. Something had to be wrong. Catherine was not cavalier about time and getting to work. I went back to my car, thinking I would drive the road that ran parallel to the path and the tree-covered trail on the north side of the street. It was foggy. Maybe she'd been hit by a car or hurt herself running and had to walk back. Why wouldn't she call, I thought, but silenced myself. I was nervous, and I pushed the alarm button by mistake on my car's remote, shattering the fog-cushioned silence of the parking lot and jarring me so much I dropped the keys and had to fumble for them while the blaring tones coursed out across the morning. Beyond what I could see, I could hear traffic on the I-430 bridge about 2 miles to the west, the white noise of the commute. I didn't have any way of knowing which direction she had gone, north and east over the bridge into North Little Rock and Burns Park, west toward the I-430 bridge and Two Rivers Park, or east along Rebsamen Road, where I was preparing to drive. I pressed the unlock button and got in the car, but I was shaking and had to use 2 hands to insert the key into the ignition of my Subaru. I backed out, turning on my headlights to bright and scanning everything in my view. I stopped at the turnaround in the parking lot and called her again, straight to voicemail. I found myself caught in a thickening stream of morning commuters to Riverdale offices and to downtown. The driver behind me flashed his lights, impatient with my slow speed. I turned into the first entrance to Murray Park that ran along the Little Rock side of the river, and I scanned the pavilions and tried to see down to the water of the boat launch. I drove through the linked parking lots, switching my lights from bright to normal, never satisfied with what I could see in the fog, which wasn't much, and wasn't Catherine. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Stacey. We know all those places too. That's amazing. You know, so I was telling the group, this is a lot of words to read. These novels are so wonderful, and I find them so steeped and situated in place. And I was hoping we could have a conversation just a little bit about when you really are focusing on place, how it is as a novelist, you kind of imagine the intersection of place in a fictional form and in a real form. So, Mark, maybe let's start with you a little bit. Yours is a historical novel. It's situated in a specific place. And how did you deal with the idea of place in this?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, definitely, since, like you said, it was an historical, I'm writing historical fiction, I needed a real place to kind of anchor things in if I was going to make it believable, I felt. But at the same time, I wasn't writing a history. I needed some room to, some wiggle room for whatever dramatic needs I needed. So I spent a good bit of time sort of locating I knew my story was going to be set around 37. And so I found a real dam that had been built in 37. I needed a place, Tennessee worked out because they had just an abundance of dams. And then I needed a place that was within a few hours drive of Memphis, since I had some dramatic needs where I needed them to go to Memphis and back. So it was definitely a process, place, and thinking in terms of place, there was definitely a lot of my balancing the dramatic needs with the reality. And so what I did in my case was I picked a town that I could center my story around, and then I visited it so that I could see what the trees looked like and what the grass looked like, and what color the rocks were, all those things that I could then sort of hang my imagination on. So I kind of rooted them in a real place, but then I changed the name of the town and I just fictionalized whatever I needed. But it was nice in that it kind of left me in a spot where, as a first-time novelist, I didn't have to create everything whole cloth. I could kind of rest on, there really was a dam and there really was a town, but then I could just, I gave myself the freedom to make up whatever I needed. So for me, place and sort of involved that back and forth, I guess. That was sort of the axis that I moved along.
How about you, Ty? There's time and place. In yours, we have this sense of it's happening in the 60s, and then you have a kind of fictionalized rock and roll band, but real pop festival, and then real places. So how did you work that through in your head?
Well, something similar to what Mark did, but different as well. So I knew I was writing this story about a young woman who was essentially like a debutante turned dissident, right? She's involved with the peace movement and becomes a terrorist of sort. And I knew that was the center of the story. And I knew that it was going to be set in Colorado, in Denver, Boulder, surrounding areas. And so what I did in order to sort of build some other story elements is I began researching Denver and Colorado in 1969. And strangely enough, I mean, the story is also about this young woman getting pregnant. And one of the things that I discovered was that in 1969, outside of Denver was this event at this bomb plant where there was a fire, the Mother's Day fire. And so then I also was, doing research, as you mentioned, the Denver Pop Festival, that becomes like a story element. And so, I basically did a lot of research. I lived in the area in Colorado for about 10 years. So I knew the place, but I didn't know the history. And so the history kind of allowed me to then navigate the story through those historical events.
How about you, Stacey? We certainly know this place. I've been to all of those places, and you know, you told me on the phone you're a runner too. So and what I found particularly interesting is I was kind of reading through this. It was you really worked with this notion of space, almost. You know, it was the right moments between places that they were going in the car. They were. So how did you work with place here? And it's a real place, of course, we all are so familiar with.
Well, I think I was really interested in having Little Rock be kind of a character in the book in a way. I wanted it to be a book or a story that could really only take place there in some ways. As you mentioned in the biography, I'm from South Dakota originally, and I'm also a Conwegian, so I'm kind of doubly outside of Little Rock, even though I've lived here since 2003. But I've always been a visitor to Little Rock, a commuter, or I go there to run. And as I mentioned to you when we talked, I thought for about 2 seconds about setting the book in Conway, but to me, Conway just didn't have the right layers. You know, the story in this book really requires different people to intersect with each other in specific ways and at specific places. And Little Rock worked well for me because I was familiar enough with it to feel like I could believably set the action there, but I was also new enough to it to observe it in a way that maybe a native, you know, might not see it, and to write about it as an observer in that way. And it was really fun for me to explore the city as a place that is, you know, not my native land. And I also was really interested in exploring the expectations of the women in the novel. And I felt that their roles too were definitely Southern influenced. And so it really needed to take place, certainly for me, in Arkansas and not where I lived before.
Brad, you were muted.
Oh yeah. So for novelists who are just beginning, help us how you do the research with when you're really thinking about delving into a place or a time. I mean, I hear Stacey, you kind of moved around and you knew it, and you moved around to different places. I'm just interested. I would imagine there's many ways to do the research. You might go to the particular place. You might read about it. You may have lived there. In your case, Ty, you're dealing with the place at a different time, and Mark too. And you kind of have to think about how you're situating that in time. How do you guys do the research, and what advice would you have to people who are setting novels in a particular place at a time that may not, you know, be now? How about you, Mark?
Sure. So, so my novel's set in 37. I found, obviously the internet is a great, you know, trove of resources. And I was dealing with a government, you know, a federal project, and they keep a lot of records. Some of the great, you know, finds of my research was I found the pay ledgers for a dam project, and that really just helped flesh out for me, you know, the scope of the work that would have been happening, you know, all the various roles that would have been played. But I also had a lot of luck looking up vintage advertising. A lot of times you know, you can find out a lot about a people if you look at what is being marketed to them. It kind of tells you a lot about their ideas of what is success and what is, you know, attainable. And that was really useful. And then lastly, I was writing about a place that was far away. I did have the luck to discover there was locally, there was a dam that also had been built in 37. And I went and was able, because it was local, I had a lot more flexibility to go, and I was able to go take a tour and, you know, and go behind the scenes, and I ended up getting some great stories that way.
How about you, Ty?
Well, you know, I guess I'd say first, you said you mentioned advice for young writers. Sometimes I think research is a crutch that maybe a writer doesn't need. I mean, to be honest, I spend a lot of time researching when I'm uncertain about the writing. And so it's just like a procrastination tool. But that said, the kind of research that I did for this book was wide ranging. You know, I mean, the plot was based on Diana Outen, whose life was very much paralleled my main character Cynthia's in certain ways. Rocky Flats was a huge deal, still is, and was a mess. And so there have been books written about it. And so a lot of the sort of technical research that I did with, say, the bomb plan in particular, I was, reading nonfiction. The funnest thing, though, I think that I found was because Rocky Flats is this, it was a big deal. The FBI closed it down in the 80s because there had been so much corruption, so much underhanded political wheeling and dealing, and environmental contamination, that I found at the Carnegie Library in Boulder, they have hundreds of hours of oral histories that are interviews with people who worked at the plant, people who were management, people who were low-level people like my character Alvin, FBI agents. And so, to understand what happened at the fire, I listened to interviews with janitors, with the security guards, all these people who were like sort of pulled in to the fire when it really wasn't their job. And so what that gave me was details of the events, but it also gave me a lot of character elements, just like hearing their deep, like Western voices and things like that, like really changed the way that I perceived the story. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a question from Chris Collier. You have all talked about research in developing your novels. I'm curious to know how you settle on an idea for a novel. Also along that line, was there a time in writing these particular novels that you second guessed yourself and thought about stopping and changing to a different story or theme? Stacey, how about you take that one up? We talked a little bit about you changing your stories.
Yeah. Well, I wrote Mr. Catherine for a novel writing class, and I only had one idea when it was due. So I had to go with that. So I didn't have the luxury of second guessing myself in that way. Although, I mean, it is a little bit scary to only have one idea because you don't feel like you have a lot of choice. But I just laughed about the second guessing because I mean, I don't ever not second guess the choices that I made. I'm working on a book now that has more, is set in different times and more historical. And I mean, I second guess constantly, but I think honestly, for me, it isn't really a decision. I mean, I joke about only having one idea, but if I want to write about it and explore it, the decision is made. If it's something that kind of goes through my mind and I'm not even interested to write about it or explore what it could be, I don't have to make a decision not to do it. I just don't work on it. And if there's an idea that I can't stop thinking about, then I have to write about it and I see what it becomes. As I said, it's not really a decision. It just is something that happens if you take the time, I think, to work on it.
Mark, I know your book was a long time in coming. We've had long conversations about this one in particular. I would imagine you've done some second guessing, and you told me that you even put this one away for a really long time and then came back to it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, first off, I do want to say I wholeheartedly agree with what Ty was saying about how research can be a crutch. There definitely at some point where you have to just kind of get going. But yeah, my novel, I worked on for about 12 years in all. So I definitely spent a lot of time sort of rethinking things. There were several drafts. And even, so like my characters are Nathan and Claire. And, in my earliest drafts, Nathan was the main character and Claire was this very secondary character. And she she's mostly the primary character in the current version. So there was definitely an evolution of the story and about where the importance lay. So I don't know where you, I don't know. I should say my original idea stayed pretty close, I suppose. Other than I really wanted Nathan to be French in the early version, and I was so so I just kind of, it didn't take long to realize this isn't going to work. This overly complicates things. So my idea, sort of simplified a little. But I don't know. I think definitely, you've got to be open to the idea of the idea evolving on you. I think you got to kind of follow the story where it takes you.
How about you, Ty? I saw earlier versions of this book and it went through many iterations. Do you find yourself second guessing yourself at certain points, and do you just drop the project, or you push forward, or?
Totally. So I had this short story called "These Are My Arms" that I thought there are some things in it that I thought it could work as a novel. And so I wrote, a 400-page thing that was my PhD dissertation, and that they awarded me a diploma is sort of beyond me based on that work. So I moved to Arkansas, and the book had like many points of view, and it was a mess. And I was like, we might only be here for 2 years, and I'd like to complete something. And so I knew that I couldn't rewrite this novel in 2 years. So there was one chapter that was backstory for the birth of one of the central characters in the novel, and that was about Cynthia, who's the main character of Radio El Dorado. And so I was like, you know what? That 20-page chapter, I know exactly how that could be expanded into just like a small volume, short novel, maybe 150 pages. I could write this in 4 weeks. And 8 years later, I had the novel Radio El Dorado. So, I mean, in terms of second guessing, I abandoned a whole project to basically write another novel out of the mess. And I still haven't been able to return to that novel. I'm not yet able to write it.
Yeah. Do you guys feel if you just have some faith in a sense and time that it'll come? I'm interested in that. I remember I was writing this story a long time ago, and I kept trying to plot it out, and it wasn't coming. And then I just kind of let go a little bit, and it did come through time. Is that what's kind of happened to some of you folks, where you just kind of let it go and have faith that it'll come?
I think I've benefited most from just writing, just exploring what can happen by writing. And the more I step back and think about it, the more I second guess and want to drop it. So I need to take my own advice, but I know that I solve writing problems by writing, and experimenting with things and following the flow of what interests me in the book. And I mean, that's how I wrote Mr. Catherine, was because I had to have 4,500 words a week for a class. So I just had to do it. And it was, in a way, it was such a gift, because it gave all of us permission to write a really bad first draft. And then you can fix it because you have something to fix.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So I'm interested. We have about 5 minutes left. What questions do you have for each other? Because you've heard each other's work, and I know you've read some of each other's work. What questions do you have for each other?
Well, I was just going to say real quickly that I have a very different experience than Stacey from, I agree with you that you solve writing problems by writing, but I also find that, I encourage my students to do this thing that I call the sophisticated daydream, which is, while I'm doing things that don't require a lot of brain power, if I'm out on my bike or I'm taking a walk or I'm doing the dishes, I put myself into the thing that I'm writing, whether it's a story or a novel. And and think through scenes and imagine things. And so I find a lot of times the solutions to story problems end up being, you know, allowing myself to have that imagination space. Mark, where are you on this continuum of solve it in your head or solve it on the page?
Yeah, no, I have to agree with you. It was a really pleasant experience during my final, draft of the novel, revising it. I would go from a run. I was running most days, and I would go for a run with one problem. I had to keep it pretty discreet. I'm not going to like solve the novel, but I need to like figure out like what is Claire's motivation here, or why is this a problem? You know, and if I could like think on that one thing, oftentimes I wasn't even that focused on it. I was just running. There was something about, you know, maybe the endorphins, I don't know, but there was something about the running process where I just time and again, I was able to solve these, to come up with solutions. I don't know.
Well, I will say, in the interest of full disclosure, that my Mr. Catherine was a book that I was working on in that way for several years and never wrote a word. It was just a movie I played in my mind, and I would get to a point where I would think, that's boring. And I wasn't really thinking about it as a book. It was just something that, you know, distracted me. So I think I did a lot of that. We call it pre-writing, right? A lot of that pre-writing. And then when I had a deadline, then I put it down. So I did both. I think I respond well to structure, but I think you're absolutely right that you have to give yourself some free time to let your mind work on things.
Are you saying that if I heard you right, that you were thinking about this story without the intent of it being like a short story or a novel?
Yeah, I have a really rich interior life.
That's awesome.
It just was something I did. You know, I started working from home. I was by myself all day, and I would just kind of play that in my mind while I was doing some of those tasks you talk about. And it just, you know, not incessantly, but just over several years. So by the time I went to write it, I really knew a lot of what would happen and who the people were.
Mark, do you have any questions for folks?
I don't know. We have 1 minute. I don't know. My question was, I was really thinking a lot about how there's sort of this discussion in fiction writing in the last few years about the limitations of what we can write, you know, and I was curious about, you know, given the works we all have here that are not strictly autobiographical, I was going to just ask if, you know, my panelists, if, you know, what surprised you most? How did you go most outside yourself and yet surprised you that worked in your novels?
I guess I do it in those digressions that I was talking about, you know, where I'll latch on to a character and I just, you know, they're not necessarily, you know, one of the 4, 5, or 6 primary characters, but there's something I just love, like drilling down into particular moments, into side characters' stories, and maybe it has to do with exactly what you're saying, that like those are where the surprises come, where it's not my life, it's just I'm, you know, really it's pure imagination, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much, guys. This was amazing. And these books are just absolutely terrific. So I hope people go to Wordsworth and pick these up and read them. I enjoyed them. Yeah, they're all holding them up. I'll hold up all 3. Absolutely. Go grab these, and they're wonderful. And you folks are just, you know, it's just an honor to have you here in Little Rock and as such phenomenal writers. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks,
Thank
Brad.
you for
Thanks,
coming.
Mark. Thanks, Stacey.
Thank you.